Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41.
The weapon they used wasn't an axe. And the 40 whacks you've heard about in the rhyme, that's not true either. But the real story of what happened inside 92 2nd Street is far more disturbing than any nursery rhyme. Welcome to Chalk and Silence, real crimes, real mysteries, real unsolved stories that were waiting in the dark. If you're new here, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, since it helps keep these stories alive. On a brutally hot August morning in 1892 in Fall River, Massachusetts, a wealthy man named Andrew Borden and his wife, Abby, were found dead in their home. They hadn't been shot or stabbed. They were bludgeoned, their skulls crushed with a hatchet-like weapon until they were almost unrecognizable. The crime was an act of pure, shocking rage. And in the center of it all was one of the most unlikely suspects imaginable. Andrew's quiet, 32-year-old daughter, a Sunday school teacher named Lizzie Borden. The case would become a national obsession, not just because of its violence, but because of the terrifying question it posed. Could the person you least expect, the quiet woman from a good family, be capable of an evil this profound? The day was Thursday, August 4th. The heat in Fall River was thick and suffocating. Inside the Borden house, the morning started like any other. The family had been sick for a few days, a stomach ailment that had left everyone on edge. Andrew Borden, a man known for his wealth, but also for being incredibly cheap, left the house around 9 a.m. for his business downtown. His wife, Abby, a stout and reserved woman, went upstairs to make the bed in the guest room. The family's maid, Bridget Sullivan, who the Borden daughters mockingly called Maggie, was outside washing windows. And Lizzie, Andrew's unmarried younger daughter, was somewhere in the house. Around 10:30 a.m., Abby Borden was on her knees, tucking the sheets into the bed frame in the guest room. She never heard the footsteps behind her. The first blow from the hatchet landed on the back of her head, and it was followed by 18 more. The attack was savage, a frenzy of violence that left her face down in a pool of her own blood. Downstairs, no one heard a thing. About an hour later, Andrew Borden came home. He was tired from the heat and his stomach illness. Finding the front door jammed, he knocked, and the maid Bridget let him in. He asked her where Abby was, and she told him she thought a friend had sent a note asking Abby to visit. This was a lie. There was no note. Lizzie was the one who told Bridget this, a detail that would later become critically important. Andrew settled onto a sofa in the sitting room to take a nap. Bridget went to her own room on the 3rd floor to rest. For a few minutes, the house was silent again. Then, just after 11 a.m., Lizzie's voice cut through the quiet. She screamed for the maid. "Maggie, come down, quick! Father's dead! Somebody came in and killed him!" Bridget rushed down the stairs to find a scene of unbelievable horror. Andrew Borden was slumped on the sofa, his face a mess of blood and bone. He had been struck 10 or 11 times with the same weapon that had killed his wife. His face was so badly damaged that one of his eyes had been split in two. He was still bleeding, which meant he had been killed very recently, while Bridget was resting in her room just 2 floors above. The police arrived to a confusing and disturbing scene. Lizzie Borden was strangely calm, almost unnaturally composed for someone who had just found her father murdered. Her answers to their questions were vague and often contradictory. She said she was in the barn loft looking for fishing sinkers when her father was killed, a story that seemed flimsy at best. Police who searched the loft found it to be stiflingly hot, with no sign that anyone had been there. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. As the police searched the house, they made another grim discovery. Upstairs in the guest room, they found the body of Abby Borden. She had been dead for at least an hour longer than her husband. This changed everything. It meant the killer had murdered Abby, waited in the house for over an hour for Andrew to return, and then killed him too. The cold, calculated patience required for that was chilling. Who would do such a thing? The investigation immediately faced a huge problem. There was no sign of forced entry. The doors were locked. Nothing of value was stolen. The crime felt personal, an explosion of rage directed only at Andrew and Abby Borden. Suspicion began to fall squarely on the only two people who were home at the time, Lizzie Borden and the maid, Bridget Sullivan. But Bridget had a solid alibi. She was outside and then in her room. Lizzie's alibi, the barn, was falling apart under scrutiny. Then, investigators started looking for a motive. They found one simmering just beneath the surface of the Borden family's respectable image. Andrew Borden was rich, but he was also a tyrant at home. He was a frugal man who kept his family in a modest house without modern plumbing, even though he could afford much better. There was also deep tension between his daughters, Lizzie and her older sister Emma, and their stepmother Abby. The sisters called her Mrs. Borden, never Mother. Years earlier, Andrew had given a property to Abby's sister. This enraged Lizzie and Emma, who felt their inheritance was being given away. The conflict was so bad that for a time, the daughters stopped eating meals with their parents. The motive, the prosecution would later argue, was simple and timeless: money and hatred. A few days before the murders, Lizzie had gone to a local pharmacy and tried to buy a poison called prussic acid. She claimed she needed it to clean a sealskin cape. The pharmacist refused to sell it to her. Was she planning a different kind of murder before settling on the hatchet? The search for the murder weapon was intense. Police scoured the property. In the basement, hidden among other tools, they found a hatchet head. It was clean, suspiciously so. It looked like it had been recently washed and coated in ash to make it look old. The wooden handle was missing. Had the killer broken it off and burned it after the murders? The prosecution believed this was the weapon. But the most damning piece of evidence came from Lizzie herself. A few days after the murders, a friend of the family saw Lizzie in the kitchen, tearing up a dress. Lizzie explained that the dress was old and stained with paint. Her friend found this odd. Why not just throw it away? Why tear it up and burn it in the stove piece by piece? The police were never able to examine the dress. The prosecution believed it was covered in her parents' blood, and that Lizzie had destroyed the single most important piece of evidence against her. Lizzie Borden was arrested and charged with the murders of her father and stepmother. Her trial began in June of 1893, and it was a media spectacle, the O.J. Simpson trial of its day. The entire nation was fascinated by the idea that this prim, proper, church-going woman could be a brutal killer. The prosecution laid out its case. They had the motive, the family strife, and the money. They had Lizzie's conflicting stories and her strange, calm demeanor. They had the attempt to buy poison. They had the story of the burned dress. And they had the hatchet head found in the basement. It was a powerful collection of circumstantial evidence. They argued that Lizzie killed Abby, waited for her father to come home, killed him, and then concocted the story about being in the barn. But Lizzie's defense team was brilliant. Their strategy was to attack the very idea that a woman like Lizzie could commit such a crime. They presented her to the all-male jury as the perfect model of Victorian womanhood. Gentle, pious, and physically and emotionally incapable of swinging a hatchet with such savage force. They argued that the police investigation was sloppy. They pointed out that no blood was found on Lizzie or her clothes on the day of the murders. If she had committed these brutal acts, how could she have emerged spotless? They also had a powerful moment of courtroom drama. The prosecution brought the preserved skulls of Andrew and Abby Borden into the courtroom, showing the jury the horrific injuries. The plan was to shock them into believing only a monster could do this. But when Lizzie saw her father's skull, she fainted. The moment created sympathy for her. It made her look like a grieving daughter, not a cold-blooded killer. The defense also offered up alternative theories. Could a secret enemy of Andrew Borden have snuck into the house? Could it have been an illegitimate son of Andrew's seeking revenge and his inheritance? These were just stories with no evidence to back them up, but they created doubt. After listening to all the evidence, the jury only deliberated for 90 minutes. When they returned, the foreman announced the verdict: not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Lizzie was free, but the public was not convinced. The famous rhyme, "Lizzie Borden took an axe," was created almost immediately, cementing her guilt in the mind of the public forever. Lizzie inherited a large portion of her father's fortune. She and her sister Emma bought a large, modern mansion in a fashionable part of Fall River and named it Maplecroft. But Lizzie was never truly free. She was a social outcast. The people of Fall River shunned her. Children would throw rocks at her door and chant the rhyme. She lived a lonely life, isolated in her big house until her death in 1927. She was buried next to her father and stepmother. The question has haunted historians and crime enthusiasts for over a century. If Lizzie Borden didn't do it, who did? No other suspect was ever seriously considered. The case remains officially unsolved, but most people who study the evidence come to the same conclusion. The burned dress, the attempt to buy poison, the weak alibi, the family hatred, and her presence as the only person with both motive and opportunity. It all points in one direction. Lizzie Borden got away with murder, perhaps by perfectly playing the part of the gentlewoman that society never believed could harbor such rage. The most terrifying monsters are often the ones hiding in plain sight. To see another story about a crime that shocked a community to its core, check out the video on your screen.